Victor Wembanyama, Jamal Murray, Alperen Sengun, Karl Anthony Towns, Pascal Siakam, Brandon Ingram, Jimmy Butler, every single player I just listed is either on a massive NBA contract or soon will be, and all of those guys I just listed were lower on the points per game list than Cam Thomas, a guy that can't get anyone to pay him right now. Thomas and the Brooklyn Nets have been trying to negotiate a new contract for months, and they've made basically zero progress. And you'd think it'd be pretty easy. The Nets need perimeter scoring, they're a rebuilding team, and Thomas is a young perimeter scorer. How is it possible that an elite scorer, a guy who possesses one of the most valuable possible skills in basketball at an extremely high level, that would seemingly be in demand by every single team in the league, has absolutely zero market? Well, it's because there's a lot of things happening here. First, the NBA isn't sure if Cam Thomas is actually good, which I know sounds crazy for a guy averaging nearly 25 points per game, but you have to think about who's been on this Nets team for the last few seasons. Thomas was drafted when they still had Kyrie and KD, but with those guys gone, there was a massive scoring void to fill. It was basically him and Mikal Bridges and not a whole lot else, which of course leads to a ton of shot opportunities. And don't get me wrong, Thomas is a talented scorer. That was his profile coming out of the draft. He's proven that in the NBA, but context is really important here. High-level scoring in the NBA just doesn't really mean what it used to. 15 years ago, there were only 7 guys that averaged 25 or more in a season, and only 10 guys that averaged 23 or more. And when you fast forward to now, it's just easier to put up big points per game numbers than it's ever been. The pace of the game has picked up massively, and of course the crazy increase in three-point shooting leads to the point per game stat itself being a bit watered down as a metric of who is truly an impact player. And that watered down scoring argument makes a lot of sense when it comes to Thomas specifically, because he is as pure of a scorer as there is in the league. He's out there to do one thing and one thing only, and it is get some shots up. And I wouldn't necessarily call him a ball hog, but he's not exactly a playmaker either. And given that and his situation with the Nets, there are probably a lot of guys that could realistically score 20 plus a game, just like Thomas did in that situation, which makes his skill set much less valuable and much harder to evaluate than it might seem at first. What might seem like a highly sought after skill set that not a lot of guys have, which of course would drive up a player's value, actually isn't as hard to find as you'd think. Another big factor here, of course, is that Thomas played just 25 games last year, and giving him a big contract right after that is definitely a risk. But he was pretty healthy in the prior 3 seasons and showed clear improvement each year. Not to mention the Nets were tanking last year, and if they were trying to compete, it's likely that Thomas could have played more than he did. And if you want to have that conversation, the Nets sitting Thomas could have been intentional so that he wouldn't play that much and thus lower his value, but that's probably a conversation for a different day. Which gets to the core of all of this, his value. NBA contracts are not given out in a vacuum. There are a lot of factors and circumstances that determine what a player is ultimately worth in a given offseason. The best way to put it is there are good off seasons in which to be an NBA free agent and bad ones. And a lot of times guys try to line up their contracts with the good ones when they can, like the massive spending spree in the summer of 2016. But as Thomas is coming off his first NBA contract, he doesn't get a chance to choose when he becomes a free agent. And unfortunately for Thomas, in this particular offseason, there are a lot of things working against him getting paid. First is what we've already established. His player type just does not have a lot of value on the open market right now. If he was a legit star, then that would be one thing, but a guy that isn't an all-star, but just a great scorer, projects as more of a sixth man, and teams aren't going out of their way to pay $30 million a year for someone that comes off the bench. If you can make that jump into being a star, then all of a sudden the contract values go up a ton as well, but until that happens, your options are pretty limited. The second thing happening here is a huge storyline from this offseason: restricted free agency. I explained this in a previous video, but essentially, Thomas is in the exact same situation that guys like Jonathan Kuminga and Josh Giddey are in this summer, where they are technically free agents and can sign with any team, but since they're coming off their first NBA contracts, they're in restricted free agency, which means that in Thomas's case, the Nets get a chance to match any offer he signs with another team. So for example, if like the Pistons offered Cam Thomas $20 million a year and he took it, the Nets would have an opportunity to match that deal and he would return to Brooklyn. And obviously that limits his value. Most teams around the league don't even bother offering restricted free agents because most of the reasonable offers get matched anyway, which further limits the value of a player like Thomas. All of a sudden, there are very few teams, if any, offering him a contract other than the Nets, so he has no leverage with which to get a better deal. Which is made that much worse by another fact of this particular offseason: a lack of cap space. Obviously, as of the recording of this video, the offseason is essentially over and teams have spent most of their money, but even at the beginning of the 2025 offseason, there was just not a lot of cap space available, which meant a very limited free agency market. And it was even worse for Thomas than it was for the other guys, because the one team with significant cap space this offseason was the Nets themselves, which again just gives him zero leverage. And all of these factors come together to create a situation in which the Nets have basically zero competition to re-sign Thomas, which is how we get to where we are now. The Nets have reportedly offered him a 2-year deal worth $14 million a year with a team option on year 2, and to this point, Thomas has refused to sign it, which makes sense. $14 million a year is low for a player of Thomas's caliber, but the bigger issue is the team option. It gives the Nets all of the control over what happens this season. If Thomas gets hurt or has a down year, they can decline the option and save the money, but if he's really good, they can accept the option and get him on a great bargain contract. And team options are actually becoming a pretty big narrative around the league right now anyway. They really weren't that common previously. You would see a ton of player options, but because of the current negotiating climate pushing a lot of the leverage towards the teams, they are using that leverage to get players on team options, which obviously, as the name implies, gives the team a ton of control. And this situation is a great example of that because the Nets are only in this position because they have all the leverage. Nobody in the league can offer Thomas more than $14 million a year anyway, and there isn't enough interest for the Nets to take off the team option. But as we talked about in other videos about other restricted free agents this offseason, there is another option. Thomas can sign what's called the qualifying offer, which, without getting into the details like I have in the past, is essentially just a 1-year contract that would get Thomas into unrestricted free agency in 2026, which sounds like the right decision here, right? He doesn't have to worry about the team option, and the contract on the table right now is only 2 years anyway, so it's not like he's giving up a ton of financial security. The problem is the qualifying offer for 1 year is much lower at around $6 million, and there's no guarantee that his situation will improve all that much as a 2026 free agent, so giving up the $8 million next year could turn out to be a pretty big deal. But with all that said, I do think it's possible Thomas would take the qualifying offer anyway, which would be a huge moment. That is a step that pretty much no restricted free agent has ever taken because the circumstances just have not lined up correctly. Jonathan Kuminga, for example, with the Warriors would be giving up a lot more money in years than what is currently being offered if he took the qualifying offer, and his role in Golden State and thus his ability to improve his value leading into 2026 free agency is much more uncertain than Thomas with the Nets. And the same sacrifices in terms of money and years would have to be made by Josh Giddey in Chicago as well, which also makes him unlikely to take the qualifying offer. But the uniqueness of the circumstances for Thomas could actually lead him to making the risky decision to accept the qualifying offer. All of which makes this a fascinating situation. A really good scorer who's clearly talented in a contract dispute with a team that might actually really need him, that could set a new precedent for restricted free agency moving forward by taking the qualifying offer. Or Thomas could take the 2-year deal being offered and then have a great year and be stuck with that team option, which would further highlight how unfair restricted free agency is for the players. And really all this just highlights just how much more complicated NBA team building is than it might look on the surface. A guy that can score as well as Thomas, you'd think would be a no-brainer decision for a team like the Nets to re-sign, but because of a bunch of different factors, it's actually become one of the more interesting situations of the entire offseason.